Usually, when we picture a revolution, we just picture a simple change in management. Like you storm the castle, you swap out a king for a president.
Right, a structural shift.
Exactly. Maybe you rewrite the tax code or, I don't know, establish a new parliament. It's fundamentally just shifting the structure at the top. But imagine a revolution that doesn't just want to change the government. It wants to outlaw the very concept of a boss.
Yeah, completely rewire human nature.
Right. Eradicate the idea of social class entirely and, fundamentally alter how a society of hundreds of millions of people operates on a daily basis. So welcome, learner, to today's deep dive. We are looking at a towering stack of historical sources and analyses today. And the stakes, they really could not be higher. We are diving into the Chinese Communist Revolution.
And the scale of what we're discussing here is genuinely difficult to conceptualize. When we talk about, say, the French Revolution or the American Revolution, we're talking about populations in the single-digit millions.
Yeah, a fraction of the size.
Right. The Chinese Revolution involved over 600 million people. And while the Russian Revolution might be, more famous globally for kicking off that geopolitical domino effect, the Chinese Revolution is arguably even more radical in its ultimate ambitions.
It's just massive.
It really is. So our goal for you today is to understand the mechanics of this transformation. We want to explore why a deeply conservative, 2,000-year-old imperial society completely fractured.
Right.
And how the radical vision of Mao Zedong sought to replace that ancient society with a completely egalitarian utopia, which ultimately led to the incredibly complex state capitalist superpower we see today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because jumping straight into the 20th century without understanding the bedrock of imperial China is, well, it's like trying to understand why a skyscraper collapsed without ever looking at its foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we get into the architecture of that empire, we need to set some ground rules for how we're going to look at this material.
That is a crucial point for anyone listening. The sources we're diving into today cover deeply polarized political ideologies. We're talking communism, nationalism, capitalism, imperialism.
The isms.
All of them. And they document some of the most violent and tragic historical events of the modern era. So we are going to examine these objectively and impartially.
Right. We aren't here to take political sides.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any of the ideologies presented. We're focusing strictly on the mechanics of history as presented in our sources. We really just want to understand the why and the how behind the actions of the people who lived through this staggering transformation.
Perfect. So let's start with that foundation. Our sources make a point that completely reframed how I view global history. If you look at Europe or the Middle East, history is defined by radical breaks. You have the fall of Rome, the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, these massive societal reboots. But China managed to maintain a highly organized, centralized society for roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years. How is that level of continuity even mechanically possible?
Well, it requires an incredibly resilient operating system. And for China, that system was anchored by a foundational political concept introduced all the way back in the Han Dynasty.
Which was?
The mandate of heaven. To understand the revolution, you first have to understand the specific type of stability it was trying to overthrow.
Now, when I hear divine mandate, my mind immediately goes to the European divine right of kings.
Right. A common comparison.
Yeah, which basically meant God put the king in charge, and therefore the king's authority is absolute and unquestionable forever. But the mandate of heaven doesn't really work like that at all, does it? I like to think of it as a cosmic performance review.
That analogy actually hits the nail on the head. The mandate of heaven meant that an emperor's divine right to rule was not perpetual. And it certainly wasn't unconditional.
So they could lose it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was entirely contingent on their practical ability to care for the population, maintain economic stability, and defend against invaders. The cosmos granted you the right to rule only as long as you successfully managed the realm.
So what happens when things go wrong? Say there's a massive drought or, I don't know, the Yellow River floods and wipes out the entire harvest. In Europe, the king might just say, well, God is testing us, pay your taxes anyway. What happens in Imperial China?
If the rivers flooded catastrophically, or if there was a widespread famine, or even if foreign invaders successfully breached the borders, it wasn't just viewed as bad luck.
Right.
It was taken as a literal cosmic sign that the current ruling family had lost the mandate. The heavens were withdrawing their support. And the mechanical consequence of that is profound.
Because it means the people can rebel.
Yes. If the emperor has lost the mandate, the people have the cosmic right, even the obligation, really, to rebel.
Which means the emperor gets fired, and whoever successfully overthrows the old dynasty and restores order, well, obviously they possess the new mandate of heaven. It's fascinating because it inherently bakes a system of justified, regular revolution into the very fabric of Chinese tradition. Like, the central government takes on the ultimate responsibility for the people, and if they fail, the people replace them.
And what's fascinating here is how that ancient expectation carries forward into the modern era. Even later revolutionary governments, including the communists, they tap into this deeply ingrained cultural expectation.
That the state has to provide.
Right, that the central authority is fundamentally responsible for the material well-being of the entire population. But of course, an emperor cannot single-handedly manage an empire of hundreds of millions of people. You need an administration. You need bureaucrats.
Yeah, and the sources referred to this administrative class as the mandarins. And we should clarify for the learner, we aren't talking about the fruit here.
No, definitely not.
When we say mandarin, we are talking about an incredibly powerful, specialized bureaucratic class. But how did someone actually become a mandarin? It wasn't just hereditary, right? Like passing it down from father to son.
No, it was based on the imperial examination system, which is honestly one of the most rigorous administrative selection processes in human history.
How rigorous are we talking?
Well, it wasn't just a simple written test. Young men would spend decades, literally their entire youth, studying classical literature, poetry, and philosophy.
Wow.
And then, when it was finally time for the exams, candidates were locked into tiny individual cells for days at a time to write highly formalized essays.
That is wild. Imagine if every state governor, judge, and mayor in your country had to spend 20 years studying philosophy and then pass a grueling multi-day isolation exam just to get a low-level government job.
It sounds extreme to us today.
It sounds incredibly intense. Why build the system that way? Like, what is the mechanical benefit to the empire to do this?
The benefit is extreme ideological uniformity. I mean,
Right.
China is massive. It's roughly the size of Europe, with diverse geographies and dialects. But because of this exam system, you had administrators from all different regions trained in the exact same values, the exact same text, and the exact same worldview. And they were sent out to manage the empire.
So they're all operating on the same software, basically.
Exactly. And the core software running on all of their minds was Confucian philosophy.
I think we need to define Confucianism here, because today when we hear the word philosophy, we might think of something very internal, like Marcus Aurelius's meditations or some feel-good mantra about finding inner peace. But the sources make it clear that Confucianism was not about self-help.
Not at all. It was not about exploring your internal emotional landscape.
Yep.
Confucianism was a strict, highly practical social blueprint.
Like a rule book for society.
Basically, it prioritized hierarchy, order, obedience, and an intense respect for elders and authority. It views society as a series of interlocking relationships.
What kind of relationship?
Ruler to subject, father to son, elder brother to younger brother. It laid out exactly what your responsibilities were based on your specific position in that hierarchy.
So if everyone just plays their assigned part perfectly, the machine runs smoothly.
Precisely. It was the perfect philosophical engine for maintaining a stable, centralized, and highly structured empire. It explicitly discouraged rocking the boat or, seeking individual glory at the expense of social harmony.
Which leads us to a really fascinating social hierarchy that the sources outline. Because in this highly structured Confucian society, they had what's called the peasant ideal.
Yes, the peasant ideal.
Now, China is a massive agricultural powerhouse. The empire only survives because millions of peasants are producing grain along the Great River valleys. So ideologically, the peasant proprietor, the farmer working a small, independent plot of land, was considered the most valued, noble member of society.
Ideologically being the operative word there.
Right, in theory.
Exactly. The peasant was revered in theory because they created the fundamental subsistence that allowed the empire to exist. They were the producers. But on the exact opposite end of the spectrum, sitting at the very bottom of the traditional social hierarchy, you had the merchants.
And in traditional Chinese society, merchants were viewed with intense suspicion. Wait, why? Because in the West, merchants are the drivers of the economy. Why did the Chinese empire hate the merchants so much?
It comes down to the Confucian view of value creation. The logic went like this. The peasant actually makes something. They plant a seed and grow wheat. The artisan takes clay and makes a bowl.
Right.
But the merchant just takes a bag of grain the peasant grew, moves it to another town, and charges more for it. They don't produce anything new. They merely extract profit by exploiting the distance between the producer and the consumer.
Ah, so they were seen as parasites. They just add cost to the system without adding actual value.
That was the perception, yes.
So despite the fact that merchants could amass huge fortunes, they had very low social status. They were actively blocked from political power. Like, they couldn't even take the imperial exams in many eras, right?
Correct. It is a stark contrast to how Europe developed, where the merchant class eventually drove political change, funded the Renaissance, and sparked the rise of capitalism. In China, the ideal was the self-sufficient peasant community, managed by the educated mandarin, ruled by the benevolent emperor.
It reminds me so much of how modern societies romanticize the family farmer. We put them on a pedestal as the backbone of the country, the truest expression of our national values.
Yeah, very similar rhetoric.
Yet, the actual day-to-day economic reality for those family farmers is often incredibly difficult, and they're frequently struggling at the bottom of the economic ladder.
That is a very apt comparison. The peasant ideal was a powerful cultural myth, but as we transition into the 19th century, the reality for actual Chinese peasants was becoming a waking nightmare. The machine was breaking down.
Which brings us to a massive question. If this system was so stable that it could absorb foreign conquerors, like the Mongols and the Manchus, and literally assimilate them until they became Chinese emperors, how did it eventually fall apart?
Well, the Manchus established the final imperial dynasty, the Qing Dynasty, and the sources point to a massive rot from within. It wasn't just one structural failure. It was a cascade of systemic breakdowns.
Okay, where does it start?
First, you have to look at the extreme isolation of executive power. The emperor lived locked away inside the Forbidden City in Beijing.
I mean, the name Forbidden City really says it all. It wasn't a public capitol building. It was an enclosed universe.
The architecture itself was a metaphor for political isolation. The emperor was increasingly cut off from the reality of the country he was supposed to be managing. Power became wildly isolated among a tiny fraction of people.
Who was actually in there?
The emperor, his many wives, who were constantly locked in the brutal, behind-the-scenes political warfare to produce the legitimate heir, and the eunuchs.
The eunuchs are such a wild historical detail that you almost can't believe it's real. Can you explain their role for the listener?
Certainly. Because the emperor had a massive harem of wives and concubines, the imperial protocol dictated that no other intact males could be allowed into the inner sanctum of the palace.
Just to ensure the bloodline, right?
Exactly, to ensure that any child born was unquestionably the emperor's. So the only men allowed inside were eunuchs men who had been castrated. Originally, they were supposed to be mere household staff, handling the daily chores of the palace.
But because they're the only ones physically in the room with the emperor, they end up controlling access to him.
Exactly. They become the gatekeepers. If a high-ranking mandarin wants to send a report to the emperor about a famine in the south, he has to hand it to a eunuch first.
Oh, wow.
This allowed the eunuchs to wield enormous, unofficial administrative power. They could demand bribes, filter information, and completely isolate the emperor from his own government.
So the official administrators, the mandarins, are cut off from the center of power. And the sources show that the mandarin class itself was actively decaying during this time too, right?
Very much so.
Like that famous rigorous examination system we talked about, it became deeply corrupt. People figured out how to cheat, or in some cases, wealthy families could simply buy their way into administrative positions without passing the tests.
And when you have administrators who bought their positions, they want a return on that investment. These supposedly objective Confucian administrators became deeply intertwined with the wealthy landowning elites out in the provinces.
So the referees are suddenly playing for the richest team. The mandarins are supposed to be protecting the peasants, maintaining that sacred peasant ideal, but instead they are helping the landlords gobble up all the available land.
Yes, exactly.
And here's where the math just becomes terrifying. The sources detail a demographic time bomb that is really hard to wrap your head around. In 1850, the population of China was roughly 430 million. By 1950, despite decades of nonstop war and famine, it had exploded to 600 million.
It's staggering. You have a massive population increase happening simultaneously with a corrupt bureaucracy that is allowing arable land to be concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy landlords.
And what's the result of that?
The mechanical result of that equation is millions of independent peasant proprietors losing their ancestral land. They're being reduced to impoverished, desperate tenant farmers, paying exorbitant rents just to survive.
And as this pressure is building, the ultimate imperial safety net snaps. For centuries, the empire maintained a vast granary system. How did that system actually work when it was functioning properly?
When the Mandate of Heaven was functioning, the state collected a portion of the grain harvest as taxes, and they stored it in massive state-run granaries distributed across the provinces. The mechanism was simple. In a year of good harvest, you store the surplus.
Makes sense.
And when a drought or flood hit, the central government would open the granaries, flood the local market with free or cheap grain, stabilize prices, and prevent mass starvation. It was the ultimate proof that the emperor cared for the people.
But by the 19th century, the sources indicate that this system just fell apart completely. Local officials were embezzling the funds meant to buy grain, or they were secretly selling the stored grain for personal profit. So when a famine hit, they opened the granary doors, and the silos were empty.
The safety net was entirely gone. Millions were left to starve. But what's fascinating here is that the crisis wasn't just economic or nutritional. In traditional Chinese society, losing your land wasn't just like facing a bank foreclosure today.
Right. It goes deeper than that.
Much deeper. Land was intimately tied to your clan, your extended family, and your religion specifically, ancestor worship.
This is a crucial point. Can you explain the mechanics of how land and religion were tied together?
In Confucianism, honoring your ancestors is paramount. Families would have ancestral shrines, and specific plots of land were dedicated to generating income to maintain those shrines and to fund the annual festivals honoring the dead.
So if you lose that land...
If you lose your land to a wealthy landlord, you don't just lose your income, you lose the ability to properly honor your ancestors. You lose your standing within the clan hierarchy.
You are entirely alienated. You are spiritually, socially, and economically unmoored.
You are stripped of the very things that give your life meaning and identity within that Confucian structure. When you take tens of millions of people and strip them of their land, their food, and their spiritual connection to their community, you are creating a highly volatile powder keg.
You have millions of starving, spiritually unmoored peasants and a corrupt government hoarding power in a forbidden city. The powder keg is full to the brim. The only thing missing is a spark.
And that spark arrives.
Right. As China is crumbling internally, a new type of barbarian arrives to provide that spark. And they aren't riding horses down from the northern plains like the Mongols. They are arriving on massive, steam-powered ships from the sea.
The Europeans. This external shock acts as a profound catalyst, accelerating and exacerbating all the internal rot we just discussed.
The sources mention the Opium War, and the name alone is wild. Why is the British military fighting a full-scale war over narcotics?
It actually starts with a cup of tea. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the British public had become absolutely obsessed with Chinese tea.
They loved it.
Loved it. They were also importing massive quantities of Chinese silk and porcelain. But the Chinese, operating under the assumption that their celestial empire already possessed everything it needed, had zero interest in buying European goods.
Right, they didn't want the stuff Britain was selling.
Exactly. They certainly didn't want cheap British textiles. Furthermore, the King Emperor demanded that all European purchases of Chinese goods be paid for in hard silver.
So it's a massive trade imbalance. The British are effectively bleeding their treasury dry, sending ships full of silver to China, and the silver isn't coming back. How do they reverse it?
Well, the British East India Company needed a product that the Chinese population would actively consume to create a reciprocal demand. And the solution they arrived at was opium, which they could grow cheaply in their colonial holdings in India.
Wait, so because the Chinese didn't want to buy British sweaters, the British decided to become state-sponsored drug cartels?
That is the mechanical reality of the situation, yes. The British began smuggling massive quantities of highly addictive opium into southern China. It created a devastating public health crisis and a severe economic drain as Chinese silver suddenly began flowing out of the country to pay for the drugs.
And the emperor obviously wasn't okay with that.
No. When the Chinese emperor realized the catastrophic social and economic impact, he appointed a specialized official who confiscated and destroyed millions of pounds of British opium. He was effectively telling the British to stop illegally selling drugs to his people.
And Britain's response to a sovereign nation enforcing its own drug laws is to send in their industrialized navy and blow the wooden Chinese navy out of the water.
That is the First Opium War, which culminates in 1842, and the defeat is a shattering, world-altering humiliation for the Qing Dynasty. It proved that the once mighty Celestial Empire was completely outmatched by modern Western technology.
And the treaties that followed were brutal.
Yes. The defeat forced China to sign a series of unequal treaties. They had to cede the island of Hong Kong to the British, pay massive reparations, and open up coastal treaty ports, like Shanghai and Canton, to unrestricted foreign trade.
And these treaty ports introduce a legal concept called extraterritoriality, which is just mind-blowing. Can you explain how this worked on the ground?
Extraterritoriality meant that foreign citizens living in these Chinese treaty ports were exempt from Chinese law.
Completely exempt.
Completely. If a British sailor committed a crime in Shanghai, he could not be arrested by Chinese police or tried in a Chinese court. He would be tried by a British consul under British law. Effectively, European powers carved out miniature colonies within sovereign Chinese cities.
That is insane.
They set up their own governments, their own legal systems, and their own heavily armed police forces right in the commercial heart of China.
Imagine that as a listener. Imagine you are a local merchant in 19th century Shanghai. Suddenly, a foreign empire defeats your military, sets up their own heavily armed police force in your downtown commercial district, and tells you that your own local laws no longer apply to them. You have absolutely no say in it. It's an unimaginable violation of national sovereignty.
And you can see how this deeply visceral experience would trigger an immense, furious Chinese nationalism. It creates a profound, searing humiliation that will become the emotional driving force for almost every political movement in China for the next century.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Whether you are talking about the nationalists or the communists later on, they all share this burning foundational desire to expel the foreigners, reclaim their sovereignty, and erase that humiliation.
But the Europeans didn't just bring opium and gunboats, they completely upended the traditional social hierarchy we talked about earlier. Remember how merchants were at the absolute bottom of the Confucian social ladder?
Right, the parasites.
Yeah. Well, this explosion of international trade suddenly creates a new class of ultra-wealthy Chinese middlemen. The sources call them compradors.
Yes, the compradors were the crucial intermediaries. European merchants needed local Chinese agents who understood the language, the local markets, and the logistics to facilitate this massive new volume of trade.
Because the Europeans couldn't just wander into the interior of the Isles.
Exactly. These compradors managed the flow of goods between the interior of China and the foreign ships on the coast. And because they took a cut of this booming international trade, they acquired massive, unprecedented wealth.
And with that wealth, they begin demanding political power and social status that the traditional Confucian system completely denies them. The mandarins and the landlords are watching these so-called lowly merchants become richer than the emperor, building Western-style mansions and sending their kids to Western schools.
It completely fractures the elite class. The old rules just no longer apply.
And while the economy is being flipped upside down, the foundational culture is being attacked as well. Because alongside the opium merchants, thousands of Christian missionaries arrive on these ships.
Now, China had a long history of religious eclecticism, right?
Right.
People might practice a blend of Buddhism, Taoism, and ancestor worship quite pragmatically without seeing any conflict. So why were the missionaries so disruptive?
Because the missionaries represented a direct, uncompromising challenge to the very fabric of Chinese culture. The missionaries insisted on absolute, exclusive conformity.
Like only one God.
Yes, there is only one true God, and to worship him, you must completely reject your traditional practices. Most crucially, they demanded the abandonment of ancestor worship, which they viewed as idolatry.
Which, as we discussed, is the spiritual glue holding the entire clan system and property system together.
Exactly.
So for the average Chinese citizen, these foreigners are ruining the economy with drugs, stealing the cities with gunboats, and trying to destroy their spiritual identity.
Combine that massive external shock with the internal collapse, the systemic corruption, the loss of land, the starvation we discussed earlier, and you get the perfect storm. You get the century of blood.
So you have millions of spiritually unmoored, starving peasants and a central government crippled by foreign empires. The powder keg is full. The only thing missing is the spark.
And ironically, that spark came from the very foreigners who were destabilizing the coast, specifically a discarded Christian pamphlet.
This brings us to the Taiping Rebellion, which runs from 1850 to 1864.
This story is just staggering. It centers around a man named Heng Xiquan.
Heng Xiquan's life is a perfect microcosm of the systemic breakdown. He was a young man from southern China who desperately wanted to become a mandarin. He took the grueling civil service exams multiple times, and he failed every single time.
He is deeply frustrated. He feels the corruption of the system, knowing that wealthier, less intelligent men are buying the positions he studied so hard for. So he has a severe nervous breakdown. He falls into this multi-day fever dream. And during this time, he remembers some pamphlets he had been handed years earlier by an eccentric Christian missionary.
And what does he do with those texts?
He begins to interpret his fever dreams through the lens of these translated, often poorly understood Christian texts. He blends them with his own visions and ultimately arrives at a staggering conclusion. He declares that he is the younger brother of Jesus Christ.
Wow.
Sent by God to cleanse China of demons, which he identifies as the ruling Manchu dynasty and the corrupt Confucian system.
The younger brother of Jesus Christ. He starts preaching this, and it absolutely catches fire. And our sources make it clear this wasn't just a localized peasant riot. How did this movement mechanically operate? How do you build an army out of a vision like that?
Well, Hong Xiuquan tapped directly into the massive reservoir of alienated landless peasants in the south. This was a millenarian movement. They believed the end of the world was at hand, and they were tasked with building a heavenly kingdom of great peace on earth.
So they needed new rules.
Right. To do this, they implemented radically egalitarian policies that completely inverted Confucianism.
What kind of policies?
They abolished private property entirely. All land and wealth were surrendered to a communal treasury. They declared absolute equality between men and women, which was revolutionary in a society that practiced foot binding and strict patriarchal control. Women were even allowed to serve in combat roles in the Taiping army.
That is a massive shift.
Huge. They banned opium, gambling, and prostitution. It was a fiercely disciplined, fanatically motivated force. They wanted to lay the mighty low and raise the poor up, bring heaven to earth right now.
And the scale of this rebellion is difficult for the modern mind to grasp. They literally march north, conquer the major city of Nanjing, and establish their own rival capital. How long does this war last, and what is the human cost?
It takes the imperial government roughly 14 years of brutal, total war to finally crush the Taiping kingdom. The death toll is hotly debated by historians, but estimates generally hover around 20 million people dead.
20 million dead.
Yeah.
That is more than the combined military and civilian casualties of World War I, happening entirely within the borders of China. And what's wild to me is that the Taiping rebels are an eerie ideological precursor to Mao's communist revolution.
They really are.
They are fiercely anti-hierarchy, pro-peasant, aiming for radical wealth redistribution. And they are operating in the exact same south-central provinces, like Hunan and Jiangxi, where the communists will later build their stronghold.
It demonstrates definitively that the sociological soil in that specific region was incredibly fertile for radical, egalitarian uprisings. The peasantry was desperate for a system that promised them dignity and land. Now, an important mechanical question arises. How does the weakened emperor actually defeat a rebellion of that size when his own imperial army is corrupt and ineffective?
Right, if the central army can't fight, who does?
The emperor is forced into a desperate compromise. He has to essentially outsource the war effort. He grants permission to local landlords, wealthy gentry, and regional elites in the provinces to raise their own private regional armies to fight the Taiping.
He tells the local rich guys, hey, use your own money, hire your own militias, and protect yourselves.
And they do. These regional armies are disciplined, they are fighting for their own land, and they ultimately win the war and crush the Taiping. But here is the fatal flaw in that strategy. After the war is over, these regional commanders don't just disband their armies and hand the power back to the emperor.
Exactly. Why would they? They have the troops, they have the weapons, and they know the central government is completely powerless to stop them.
So they just keep them.
They keep the armies. They keep the regional tax revenue. This forces China to fracture into a patchwork of independent, militarized territories controlled by local dictators. This marks the beginning of the warlord era. The central government in Beijing is now just a hollow shell, a ceremonial facade masking a deeply divided country.
I want to highlight one specific incredible moment from the sources that perfectly captures how upside down the social order had become during this fracturing, the 1910 Changsha riot. Can you walk us through the mechanics of what happened there?
Yeah, so in 1910, in the city of Changsha, there was a severe localized grain shortage, largely caused by flooding. The local peasants were starving. However, the wealthy modern merchant class, the compradors and businessmen tied to foreign trade, had stockpiled grain.
So they had the food.
They had it. But instead of releasing it to the local population, they were hoarding it to sell at highly inflated prices or planning to export it for profit. The starving peasants, driven to the brink, erupted into a massive riot, attacking the merchants and the foreign-owned businesses.
And in this moment of sheer violent desperation, who sides with the peasants? You would think the government would crush the riot to protect the businesses, but instead, the traditional mandarins, the old conservative Confucian bureaucrats, actually support the rioting peasants.
It is a stunning reversal. It's an alliance of the very top of the ancient society and the very bottom, uniting to attack the new, rising capitalist middle class.
That's crazy.
The mandarins viewed the greedy merchants as violating the fundamental moral responsibility to feed the people. It was a last-gasp effort by the old bureaucracy to assert the ancient peasant ideal and preserve their traditional moral authority against the terrifying, amoral, new world of global capitalism.
But it's too late. The machine is completely broken, and in 1911, the 2,000-year-old imperial system doesn't end with a massive, cinematic, explosive battle. It just whimpers out.
Yeah, it just stops functioning.
The central government is so inefficient, so bankrupt, and so powerless against the warlords and the foreigners that the last Manchu emperor, who was literally just a toddler at the time, simply abdicates the throne. The celestial kingdom is officially gone, leaving behind a chaotic, terrifying vacuum.
The emperor is gone. The mandate of heaven is suddenly up for grabs. And the question that would define the entire 20th century for China came, who is going to fill that void?
Right.
Over the next decade, two deeply opposed political movements emerged from the chaos to fight for the absolute future of the country.
Let's look at the two contenders. First, we have the nationalists, officially known as the Kuomintang, or KMT. They were founded by a Western-educated doctor named Sun Yat-sen, who is revered as the father of modern China. But the movement really solidifies its power and its military muscle under a general named Chiang Kai-shek.
If we want to understand the nationalist vision for China, we have to understand who Chiang Kai-shek was.
What do the sources tell us about him?
They point out some highly revealing details about Chiang's profile. He was deeply conservative. He was a convert to Christianity, specifically Methodism, which aligned him culturally with many Western powers.
Okay.
And crucially, he was married into the Sun family, one of the wealthiest, most powerful banking and industrialist families in all of China.
That marital alliance perfectly symbolizes his political base. He isn't organizing farmers in the mud. Chiang Kai-shek drew his support from the urban businessmen in the prosperous coastal cities, from foreign investors who wanted stability for their trade, and from the wealthy rural landlords who feared peasant uprisings.
His vision for China was a strictly top-down modernization. He wanted to build a powerful, centralized nation-state with a modern military capable of crushing the regional warlords. Economically, he favored state-driven capitalism, fueled by alliances with foreign powers and the expertise of the urban elite.
He basically wants to build a modern capitalist nation, and he is totally fine with extreme economic inequality as long as the country gets rich, unified, and powerful on the global stage.
Right.
On the complete opposite side of the spectrum, you have the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, founded in 1921. And a young leader begins to emerge within their ranks, Mao Zedong.
Mao's background provides a fascinating contrast. He was from Hunan province, right, in that south-central hotbed of commercial disruption and historical rebellion we discussed with the Taiping.
And ironically, for a man who would become the ultimate champion of the poor, he was the son of a wealthy, highly successful peasant.
A peasant who actually learned how to play the new commercial markets, buying up grain and land to get rich. And Mao absolutely despised his father for it.
He viewed his father as an exploiter.
Completely.
Yeah.
Mao grew up watching the brutal commercialization of agriculture absolutely ruin traditional peasant life, creating vast, visible inequalities right in his own village.
So while Chiang Kai-shek is looking at the coastal cities, the banks, and the factories as the glorious future of China, Mao is looking at the rural countryside, burning with a desire to dismantle the hierarchy and return to a more egalitarian, equitable society based on the peasant masses.
Now, at this early stage in the 1920s, the nationalists are vastly more powerful, better funded, and better armed than the tiny, nascent Communist Party.
Yeah, it's a total mismatch.
And this leads to a fascinating, highly pragmatic geopolitical twist. We have to talk about the Soviet Union's role here. You would naturally assume that the Soviet Bolsheviks, the ultimate communist revolutionaries who just took over Russia, would immediately throw all their money and guns behind Mao and the Chinese communists, right?
Ideological brothers in arms.
It seems like the obvious move, but they don't. Initially, the Soviet Union directed its massive financial and military support entirely toward Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists.
Wait, why? Why would the Soviets fund a conservative capitalist general over a communist uprising?
It was pure, cynical geopolitical pragmatism. The Soviet Union had just survived its own devastating civil war and foreign intervention. They shared a massive, vulnerable border with China.
They needed safety.
Exactly. When the Soviet leadership looked at the chaotic, fractured mess of warlord China, they decided they didn't need a pure, ideologically perfect communist utopia next door. They needed a strong, modernized, unified neighbor to act as a buffer state and protect their eastern borders from rival imperial powers, particularly Japan and Britain.
And Chiang Kai-shek, with his wealthy backers and growing military ambition, looked like the horse most likely to win the race. The Soviets even helped establish and fund Chiang's military academy, the Whampoa Academy.
Yeah, they literally told the Chinese communists, listen, you guys are too small, play nice, submit to the nationalists, and work within their system. They are the ones who are actually going to unify the country.
So for a few years in the 1920s, you have this incredibly uneasy, volatile alliance known as the First United Front. The nationalists and communists are working together, ostensibly united by their shared desire to defeat the regional warlords and kick out the foreign imperialists.
But the alliance was built on dynamite. And in April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek lights the fuse. It's known as the Great Betrayal, or the Shanghai Massacre.
What was the mechanism of this betrayal? What actually happened?
As the combined nationalist and communist forces marched north to defeat the warlords, they approached the massive industrial port of Shanghai. The communist labor organizers had actually gone ahead and incited massive strikes among the factory workers, essentially paralyzing the city and handing it over to the approaching army.
So the communists did the heavy lifting there.
Right. But Chiang realizes that these communists, by organizing factory workers and demanding radical labor rights, are a direct existential threat to his base of wealthy industrialists and foreign investors who own those factories.
He looks at his allies and realizes they are trying to destroy the very people funding his army. So as nationalist forces enter Shanghai, Chiang orders an absolute, merciless purge.
He unleashes his military, secretly coordinating with local organized crime syndicates, the Green Gang, to attack the labor unions. He slaughters thousands of his own communist allies in the streets.
It's just a bloodbath.
Tens of thousands more are hunted down, thrown into prison, or executed in the weeks that follow. The purge completely shatters the CCP's urban working-class base in a matter of days.
It is a devastating, near-fatal blow that forces the surviving communists to literally run for their lives, abandoning the urban centers entirely and fleeing deep into the rugged, remote mountains of the southern countryside. They are decimated. They have no money, no factories, and no urban workers.
And this moment of absolute defeat is the exact moment where Mao Zedong makes a monumental ideological shift that will change the course of global history.
I love the catchphrase for this. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because to understand why Mao's next move is so radical, we have to look at the rule book he was supposed to be following. Orthodox Marxism. How is a communist revolution supposed to work, according to Karl Marx?
According to Orthodox Marxist theory, a true socialist revolution must be led by the urban, industrial working class, the proletariat.
Okay, so factory workers.
Yes. The mechanical theory is that capitalism builds massive factories. Those factories create millions of exploited, concentrated workers, and eventually those workers achieve class consciousness, unite, and overthrow the factory owners. Revolution is viewed as the inevitable end stage of advanced industrial capitalism.
Right. The script dictates that you need cities, you need factories, and you need industrial workers to have a revolution. The peasantry was viewed by Marx as fundamentally backwards, conservative, and incapable of leading a modern revolution. But Mao is sitting in the rural mountains of Hunan province, entirely cut off from the cities. He looks around and says, "We don't have enough factory workers. 90% of China is peasants. The peasants aren't a sideshow. They are the revolution."
It is a profound Marxist heresy. Mao argues that the ancient egalitarian Chinese peasant village, where people historically shared resources, worked the land together, and resented vast wealth disparities, is actually the perfect sociological model for a future communist society.
So he flips the script.
He does. He realizes that the immense localized anger of the peasantry, the anger over lost ancestral land, brutal rents, and corrupt landlords, is an untapped reservoir of unimaginable power. If he can harness that agrarian rage, he can turn it into a national revolutionary force.
He essentially fires the industrial worker from the lead role and replaces them with the rural farmer as the hero of the historical story. And the communists start having real practical success in the South. They organize peasant soviets, they violently redistribute land from the rich to the poor, and they build a localized, self-sufficient state.
But Chiang Kai-shek hasn't forgotten about them. He wants them exterminated.
In the early 1930s, Chiang launches a series of massive, highly organized military encirclement campaigns. Using modern weapons and tactics, he slowly builds a tightening noose of blockhouses and barbed wire around Mao's rural bases, aiming to starve them out and crush them completely.
By 1934, the communists are completely surrounded. They are facing absolute annihilation. And their response is an act of sheer, unimaginable physical desperation. They break through a weak point in the nationalist lines and begin what becomes known as the Long March.
The Long March is one of the most grueling military retreats in human history. They decided to abandon their established bases in the south and literally walk to a new, theoretically safer base in the remote mountainous caves of Yan'an in the far north of China.
But they couldn't just march in a straight, logical line because Chiang Kai-shek's massive armies were constantly chasing them, bombing them from the air, and blocking the main roads.
They have to march in this massive, evasive, looping arc through some of the most brutal, unforgiving terrain on the planet. Can you describe what they were actually walking through?
They marched on foot for over a year, covering an estimated 6,000 miles. To put that in perspective, that is roughly the distance of walking from New York to San Francisco and then turning around and walking all the way back.
And it wasn't paved roads.
No. They crossed freezing, oxygen-deprived snow mountain ranges. They slogged through treacherous, disease-ridden swamps where men would simply sink into the mud and disappear. They fought desperate battles to cross raging rivers under heavy machine gun fire, all while suffering from extreme starvation and dysentery.
And the mathematical detail that just stops you in your tracks? Out of the massive army of roughly 86,000 men and women who broke out and started the march, how many actually made it?
Only about 7,000 of the original marchers survived the entire journey to reach Yan'an.
7,000 out of 86,000. It's an attrition rate that is almost incomprehensible.
Others were recruited along the way, so their total numbers were slightly higher upon arrival, but the loss of life was horrific. Yet, those 7,000 survivors became the absolute unbreakable core of the Chinese Communist Party.
It's like the ultimate loyalty test.
Exactly. Surviving the Long March became the ultimate badge of honor, an unshakable proof of dedication, physical endurance, and ideological purity. It forged a leadership cadre bound by unimaginable shared trauma, and it legitimized Mao Zedong's absolute unquestioned leadership of the party for the next 40 years.
It forged them in an unbelievable crucible. But let's look at the strategic reality. They are safely hiding in the northern caves, yes, but they are still a tiny, exhausted force compared to Chiang Kai-shek's national army. It seems like only a matter of time before the nationalists restock, march north, and finish them off.
But then, history violently flips the board entirely.
Right. An external force intervenes and completely alters the trajectory of the Chinese Civil War, the Japanese Empire.
Starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and escalating into a full-scale, incredibly brutal invasion of China in 1937, Japan unleashes its modern industrialized military. They systematically sweep down the eastern coast.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this invasion presents a bitter, almost unbelievable strategic irony for the nationalists. Where exactly does Japan focus its overwhelming attack?
They focus on the coastal industrial cities, Shanghai, Nanjing, Canton, the entire eastern seaboard.
Exactly the places where Chiang Kai-shek built his entire power base.
Yes.
The Japanese conquer the cities where his wealthy business supporters live, they bomb the factories that supply his army, and they seize the ports where his foreign investments are concentrated. Chiang's revenue streams, his modernized infrastructure, and his political base are systematically dismantled by the Japanese military.
The nationalists are forced into a desperate, bleeding retreat deep into the rugged interior of China, establishing a wartime capital in Chongqing. They lose their access to vital industrial resources and are forced to watch their best. German-trained armies get chewed up and destroyed in conventional set-piece warfare against a vastly superior Japanese military.
And what happens to their economy?
Cut off from their wealth, the nationalist government begins printing money, causing hyperinflation. And they become increasingly crippled by massive internal corruption as officials try to enrich themselves while managing a failing war effort.
And what are the communists doing during this exact same time? They are safely isolated in the rugged, barren mountains of the north, an area the Japanese have relatively little interest in because there are no major factories, no banks, and no vital ports.
Right. It's not a strategic priority for Japan.
So Mao uses this time of relative isolation to perfectly execute a brilliant dual strategy. How do they operate during WWII?
First, they drastically accelerate their social engineering and land reform programs in the northern villages they control. They violently overthrow the local landlords, seize the land, and redistribute it directly to the poorest peasants.
Building that loyalty.
Exactly. This builds massive fanatical loyalty among the rural population. The peasants now have a tangible, life-changing economic reason to fight to the death for the communists, protecting their newly acquired land.
And militarily, they aren't lining up in trenches to fight the Japanese tanks, right?
No, instead of fighting massive suicidal conventional battles like the nationalists are forced to do, the communists perfect the art of guerrilla warfare. They fight a war of extreme mobility and attrition.
Hit and run.
Exactly. They organize the peasants into local militias, they sabotage railway lines, launch midnight ambushes on isolated Japanese patrols, and then immediately melt back into the sympathetic peasant population. Mao famously described this strategy as the guerrilla being the fish, and the peasant population being the water the fish swims in.
And crucially, through these constant, highly publicized guerrilla attacks, the communists successfully present themselves to the broader public as the true, fierce, anti-foreign nationalist defenders of the Chinese people, while Chiang Kai-shek looks weak and corrupt, hiding in the interior.
So while the nationalists are bleeding out, losing their territory, and alienating the population through corruption and forced conscription, the communists are actively expanding their administrative control across the vast rural north.
Swelling their ranks.
Swelling their ranks with millions of devoted peasant recruits. They emerge from World War II vastly stronger, more disciplined, and more popular, while the nationalists emerge shattered, bankrupt, and exhausted.
So when the United States drops the atomic bombs and Japan surrenders in 1945, the Chinese Civil War immediately resumes. But the balance of power has completely shifted. Backed now by massive stockpiles of weapons captured from the surrendered Japanese army in Manchuria, which the Soviets hand over to the CCP, the communists sweep down from the north.
It is effectively violently eradicating the 2,000-year-old landlord class in a matter of a few years. Having secured the countryside, the state then launches a massive Soviet-style push for heavy industrialization.
And initially, the economic results are staggering, right? The sources show that between 1950 and the mid-1960s, China achieves an unprecedented industrial growth rate of roughly 13 to 15% annually. They are hurtling toward becoming a modern industrial power faster than almost any nation in history.
That's right.
You would think Mao would take a victory lap. The economy is booming, the peasants have land, the foreigners are finally gone, the humiliation is erased. But for Mao, this isn't enough. Why?
Because Mao didn't just want a wealthy, powerful country. He was deeply, almost pathologically obsessed with fighting a permanent war on human hierarchy. This is the absolute crux of Mao's radicalism.
Oh, so?
He looked at modern industrialization, whether it was happening in capitalist America or in the communist Soviet Union, and he saw the exact same fatal flaw: the reliance on hierarchy and specialized expertise.
Right. Think about your own job, or any modern institution. How do you run a factory or a hospital or a power plant? You have workers on the floor, you have shift managers, you have highly trained engineers, and you have an executive board. You have a rigid hierarchy based on specialization and technical expertise.
But Mao absolutely despised the concept of specialization.
He thought it was dangerous.
He fundamentally believed that creating a meritocracy of engineers, bureaucrats, and technical experts would simply recreate the old imperial system they had just fought so hard to destroy. Instead of conservative Confucian mandarins ruling over the peasants, you would just have communist mandarins, a new, arrogant, elite ruling class of technocrats lording their superior education and expertise over the common people.
He feared it would just be the same oppression with different titles.
Yes. He feared that specialization dehumanized people, separated them from physical labor, and inherently led to deep social inequality.
So he asks a terrifying question. How do you run a massive modern industrial society without bosses, without managers, and without specialized experts? And his answer is, we will just use the sheer willpower, physical labor, and collective equality of the peasant masses.
We don't need engineers. We have revolutionary enthusiasm.
Right. This specific ideological drive leads directly to the Great Leap Forward in the late 1950s.
Mao attempts to force this non-hierarchical modernization into existence. He genuinely believes you can achieve massive industrial output without the need for complex industrial bureaucracy or scientific expertise.
The sources highlight the backyard blast furnaces, which is just an astonishing visual. Can you explain the mechanics of what they were trying to do here?
Mao wanted to rapidly increase China's steel production to surpass Great Britain, but instead of building massive, centralized hierarchical steel mills in cities managed by engineers, he ordered peasant villages across the entire country to build tiny, primitive clay furnaces in their backyards.
So everyone is a steel worker now.
The peasants were ordered to melt down their own cooking pots, their farming tools, and even doorknobs to make steel collectively, while simultaneously trying to farm their fields.
But how does that actually work mechanically? Making high-grade industrial steel requires extreme, sustained heat, specific chemical additives to remove carbon, and specialized metallurgical knowledge. You can't just throw a frying pan into a wood fire and get a steel beam.
Exactly. And that was the fatal flaw. The backyard furnaces just produced useless, brittle clumps of pig iron that cracked under pressure and could not be used for construction or machinery.
Just a total waste.
It is a massive waste of raw materials and human energy. Furthermore, to fuel these millions of tiny fires, the peasants chopped down entire forests, causing severe ecological damage.
And while everyone is obsessively focused on making fake steel to meet arbitrary political quotas, what is happening to the actual food supply?
At the exact same time, Mao was herding the entire rural population into massive people's communes. These were intended to be perfectly egalitarian, self-sufficient communities where private property was entirely abolished, even down to cooking pots, since everyone ate in massive communal mess halls.
Forced equality.
The goal was that no one was just a farmer or just a steelworker. Everyone did everything, preventing any managerial elite from forming.
But because all the labor is diverted to the useless furnaces, and because the state mandated completely unscientific experimental farming techniques based on ideological loyalty rather than agronomy, the crops are literally left to rot in the fields.
We must be clear and objective about the historical consensus here. The Great Leap Forward was an unparalleled catastrophe. The attempt to completely bypass administrative structure and scientific expertise severely damaged the Chinese economy and resulted in a famine that killed an estimated 30 to 45 million people.
It's hard to even fathom that number.
It is arguably the deadliest famine in recorded human history. It proved definitively, through immense tragedy, that modern, large-scale industrialization fundamentally requires administrative structure, technical specialization, and scientific reality.
The reality of the modern world hit the utopian dream like a brick wall. The disaster is so profound that Mao is forced to step back slightly from day-to-day management. More pragmatic leaders in the party step in to fix the shattered economy by reintroducing some basic hierarchy, allowing some private plots of land, and listening to the experts again.
But Mao refuses to accept that his dream of absolute equality is impossible.
He simmers for a few years, and then in 1966 he launches his final, most desperate attack against his own party's pragmatists, the Cultural Revolution.
Mao concludes that the party itself is being infected by capitalist roaders and elitists who want to return to a society of hierarchy and meritocracy. So he makes an astonishing move. He bypasses the established Communist Party apparatus entirely and appeals directly to the youth of China.
He unleashes the Red Guards.
Yes, millions of radicalized, fanatically loyal high school and university students.
He essentially tells the teenagers of China, it is right to rebel. The adults have lost the revolutionary spirit. He points these massive student armies at the teachers, the factory managers, the scientists, and the party officials, and the specifics of how this played out are just chilling. Can you describe the mechanics of a cultural revolution purge?
It was characterized by terrifying public spectacles known as struggle sessions. University professors, factory managers, high-level bureaucrats, essentially anyone with specialized knowledge, authority, or ties to traditional culture, were dragged out of their offices or classrooms by mobs of students.
And what did they do to them?
They were forced to wear dunce caps, violently physically beaten, publicly humiliated in front of thousands of people, and systematically stripped of their jobs and dignity.
And what happened to them after they were purged? Did they just go to prison?
Many were imprisoned or driven to suicide, but a massive number were sent down to the countryside. They were exiled to remote rural villages and ordered to do grueling manual peasant labor, often for decades.
Dead men work the fields.
Mao's logic was that these intellectuals needed to learn what it truly meant to be a common peasant, to have their arrogance and elitism purged through harsh physical toil in the mud.
But think about the devastating mechanical result of that policy on a national level. You are deliberately, systematically decapitating your own country's administrative, intellectual, and scientific brain trust. You're sending your top engineers and surgeons to plant rice, while ideologically pure teenagers are left to try and run the factories and the hospitals.
It's a recipe for collapse.
The economy, the legal system, and the entire educational system grind to a completely chaotic, violent halt.
It was Mao's last, incredibly destructive gasp to prevent the modernization process from inherently creating a hierarchical society. And it ultimately fails because a complex modern nation-state simply cannot function, cannot feed itself, and cannot defend itself in a permanent state of anti-intellectual anarchy.
The experiment to kill hierarchy finally ends when Mao dies in 1976. The utopian fever breaks. Which brings us to our final act, the pragmatic pivot.
After a brief power struggle, the pragmatists who survived the purges returned to power. And the most important figure to emerge is Deng Xiaoping.
And his history is so telling.
Deng's personal history perfectly encapsulates this massive historical pivot. He was a veteran of the legendary Long March. He was a foundational, hardened communist. But during the Cultural Revolution, he was purged, publicly humiliated, and placed under house arrest, labeled an elitist, precisely because he argued that China actually needed technical expertise, material incentives, and structured hierarchy to modernize.
But after Mao's death, Deng outmaneuvers his rivals and ascends to supreme leadership. And he executes a massive, world-changing pivot. He essentially looks at the country and says, "We tried the pure egalitarian utopia and we starved. It didn't work. Now we are going to focus on actual, tangible economic development."
He introduces a system that becomes known as state capitalism.
How did that work in practice?
Deng begins systematically, piece by piece, dismantling the core structures of Mao's rural vision. He breaks up the massive, highly inefficient, state-controlled agricultural communes. He introduces the household responsibility system, which allows individual peasant families to lease plots of land from the state.
Back to the family farmer, sorta.
Crucially, while they still have to meet a state quota, they are allowed to grow extra crops for personal profit and sell them in newly established, localized free markets.
He brings back the profit motive. He says, it is glorious to get rich. And even more radically, he turns his gaze to the outside world, the very foreign investment, the global capitalists, the Western markets that the entire 100-year revolution fought so violently to expel. Deng Xiaoping invites them back in.
He sets up special economic zones along the southern coast, ironically, in many of the same areas as the old 19th century treaty ports.
History repeating itself.
He uses these zones to harness foreign capital, Western technology, and an immense pool of cheap Chinese labor to build massive, globally integrated export industries. The emphasis of the state shifts entirely away from creating a perfectly equal society through class struggle and moves laser-focused toward maximizing economic growth, technological advancement, and national wealth.
But it's not a democracy.
No, the Communist Party still maintains an absolute iron grip on political power and controls the major strategic industries, but it unleashes market forces to drive the day-to-day economy.
And the resulting economic boom is mathematically unprecedented in human history. Over the next few decades, hundreds of millions of people are lifted out of absolute poverty. China transforms into the factory of the world. But, as our sources note, this rapid commercialization brings back the exact tension Mao was so terrified of.
Yes, you have incredible historic economic growth, but you also have the return of massive, glaring wealth inequalities. You have billionaires in Shanghai living alongside struggling migrant workers. Furthermore, the commercialization and mechanization of agriculture means that far fewer people are actually needed to farm the land.
Which triggers the largest human migration in the history of the world. Tens of millions, eventually hundreds of millions of peasants leave the rural countryside and flood into the coastal megacities looking for factory work and construction jobs.
It's the exact same sociological dynamic that destabilized the Qing Empire in the 19th century. You have massive populations moving, disconnecting from their traditional roots, seeking wage labor, and facing stark inequality in the urban centers.
It's a powder keg all over again.
It creates a profound, ever-present risk of social instability, which the government must constantly aggressively manage through immense state security and surveillance apparatuses.
If we step back and summarize this staggering journey, China transitioned from a 2,000-year-old imperial system, anchored by the absolute moral authority of the mandate of heaven and the Confucian bureaucracy. It suffered through a century of bloody foreign exploitation and apocalyptic internal rebellion.
Right.
It then plunged into a radical, violent communist experiment that desperately tried to force a localized, egalitarian peasant utopia onto a massive modern state. And finally, it landed in a hyper-modern, highly efficient, but deeply hierarchical system of state capitalism.
It is a breathtaking arc of historical transformation.
So what does this all mean? If you want to understand modern China's deep, almost existential fear of internal instability, you just have to look at this history. You have to look at the century of absolute chaos, foreign humiliation, warlord fragmentation, and catastrophic famine that they barely survived. For the Chinese state, order and stability aren't just abstract political goals, they are visceral survival mechanisms.
The memory of that chaos is burned deeply into the institutional DNA of the state and the cultural memory of the populace.
And it leaves us with one final, profound paradox based on our sources. For 3,000 years, the peasant proprietor, the humble farmer on a small plot of land, was the ideological, spiritual, and economic foundation of Chinese identity. It was the peasant who overthrew the emperors when the mandate was lost, and it was the peasant who fought the guerrilla wars and legitimized the communist victory in 1949.
That's the bedrock.
But today, as state capitalism drives the greatest mass migration in human history, pulling hundreds of millions of people off the land, out of the villages, and inserting them into the rigid hierarchy of modern, industrialized megacities, what happens to the soul of a civilization when a society built on the peasant ideal simply runs out of peasants?
That is a fascinating question, and one that will likely define their next century.
Remember the mandate of heaven, that cosmic performance review? It seems the terms of the review have fundamentally changed once again. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.